First of all, Steve, welcome to Parliament and thank you for joining Inside Canberra. But firstly, can I ask you, you're obviously one of Australia's most successful IT entrepreneurs. What led you from being a successful businessman to creating the Global Peace Index?
Gee, that's a really good question. Actually, what happened is I moved from IT into developmental aid, so set up a family foundation. We're active in a whole range of countries like Burma, Laos, Cambodia, East Timor, Papua New Guinea, Rwanda, Congo, Tanzania, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Malawi and India. You'll note all of these countries are rife with conflict. And it was actually the Congo. I was walking through the Congo one day, looking at some projects over there, and I started to wonder what was the opposite of all these stressed out countries I was spending time in, and what were the most peaceful nations in the world, and was there anything I could learn from that to bring to my projects? And to my astonishment, I couldn't find anything which listed the most peaceful country in the world. And that's how the Global Peace Index was born. But there's something really quite profound in that, because if a simple businessman like myself can be walking through Africa and wonder what are the most peaceful nations in the world and it hasn't been done, then how much do we actually know about peace? And if you don't measure something, can you actually understand it? And if you're not measuring it, how do you even know if your actions are helping or hindering you in achieving your goal? And peace being one of the highest ideals which humanity aspires for, I just felt we needed to measure it.
Well, we've seen the rankings, and Iceland ranks this year as the most peaceful country, with Sudan or Afghanistan down the bottom. How do you determine what a peaceful country is?
Well, what we do is we use a definition of peace called the absence of violence or fear of violence. Now, that's a nice, nutty definition, which most people will agree with, and something which you can measure. The other thing which we do is actually measure the internal peacefulness of a nation and combine it with the external peacefulness to bring together a composite index. The index has 23 indicators, so internally we'd measure things like the level of violent crime, number of homicides, number of people in jail, state-sponsored terror, availability of weapons, number of police and internal security officers per 100,000, likelihood of terrorist attacks. Externally, we'd look at the percentage of GDP spent on the military, number of soldiers per 100,000 population, the number of conflicts which a country's engaged in, number of battlefield deaths, and on the positive side, just what a nation's commitment is to UN peacekeeping.
Now that you've produced 6 annual reports, what are your most significant findings?
Gee, what amazed me actually, and it really only struck me this year, as we look back, we just looked at the change of global peacefulness in the last 6 years. We've actually now got something which can actually determine whether peace is improving or not. And that may sound trivial, but that's highly significant when from one year to the next it was very, very hard to determine what was happening globally with peace. So we go back over the last 6 years, actually there hasn't been much change in peace. But what you'll find as you move from year to year, different years change. So peace fell off for a couple of years just after the GFC, and last year the world actually improved its peacefulness. But something actually really remarkable also happened this year, and it'd be something which may actually have historic significance over time. Sub-Saharan Africa is no longer the least peaceful region in the world. That's been supplanted by the Middle East and North Africa. And just looking at the international events which are occurring now, that'll at least hold for another 2 years. Africa has improved its relationships with neighbouring states, and that's the relationship between the different nations in Africa, more than any other region of the world over the last decade.
How could the Australian government be more effective in its foreign policy towards peace?
Well, that's really, I think, a great question. See, once you've arrived at a index, and particularly a well-nuanced index, which measures peace, what you can do now is do a whole lot of statistical analysis. You're taking other data sets, attitudinal surveys, indexes, and now you can start to describe the kind of environments which are associated with peace. So we put a lot of work in doing this at the Institute for Economics and Peace, and come up with a taxonomy which describes how you actually create a peaceful society. In other words, the institutions, attitudes and structures which lead to a peaceful society. And I think the government could do a lot more in its foreign policy in terms of trying to actually create the kind of governance and structures which will create lasting peace, but similarly trying to find the countries which are starting to lose these structures, where they're decaying, and trying to put in mechanisms to stop them actually falling into chaos.
Do you liaise with the government, the ministers involved, and inform them of your findings?
Well, it varies from country to country. So we've met with the number of government ministers in the UK over the years. Done in the US also, a number of members of Congress who follow and use our work. And there's the Club of Madrid, which consists of 89 ex-presidents and prime ministers. They draw on our work to use in the mentoring which they give to current leaders. That'd be some of the examples.
How can you ascribe a dollar value to peace?
Gee, now that is interesting. So we did a study on the US, we titled the US Peace Index, and what it did is it took the 50 states of the US and measured their peacefulness, and then what we did is worked out what lost peace was costing the US economy. So at the end of the day, if the US had the same levels of peacefulness as Canada, that would be $361 billion, which would be an additional value. Now, how do you arrive at that? So, one is you can look at the cost of crime, so there are figures on that. Particularly, we only measure really violent crime, like homicides and violent crime. So the statistics you can get out of the government departments on that. You know the cost of policing, because the judicial system, so you take that into account. You know the cost of incarceration, you divide that by the number of prisoners and you can come up with a cost for that. And then you've got lost productivity issues which you bring in. So for example, the average person murdered in the States is approximately 25 years old. They're losing 40 years of lost revenue. So you take the 40 years and multiply it by the average wage, and that gives you an idea of, let's say, the cost of homicide. And obviously that's an economic value and ignores the human suffering involved in it as well.
People talk about war being associated with resource constraints, but do you see an environmental value in peace?
Gee, that's the... there's certainly what we can see from studying peace is that nations which are highly peaceful tend to be more resilient to shocks. So, for example, Iceland this year is the most peaceful country in the world. It was the first year we did the index, but if we look at the GFC, it was the nation which suffered the worst. So, what happens with peaceful nations? They're resilient, and so we can see it recovered well from that external shock. Compare that to Greece. Now, if we come back and now move that into an environmental sense, we can look at Haiti after the hurricane there, and then come back and compare that to Japan after the tsunami. Japan, and you can see the resilience and the way that pulls those societies back. So one of the things, the studies we're looking at actually launching sometime in the next few months, is to go through the environmental sustainability indexes and registers, pull out the pertinent statistics from them, and then combine them with the structures which we use to describe a peaceful society, which we'll call the structures of peace. And now you've got ability to be able to measure the resilience of nations which are actually faced with future environmental shocks and their ability to be able to recover. You do this now, and now you weigh it by the number of people affected in each of these countries. You've got an idea of where you're likely to have the future conflicts break out over resources.
Steve Killeleagh, thank you for joining us here at Inside Canberra.
Oh, Michael, look, it's been lovely being interviewed. Thank you.